welcome to the podcast. It is so good to have you here.
Thanks, Jeff.
So we are talking about the Harrison Campus series. You and Anyta Sunday released the third book in that series earlier this month. And before we dig into Better Be True, tell us what this series is about for those who may not be familiar.
So we started this, believe it or not, the story of this started about 9 years ago. We started with the first book, and it was sort of like a short story we wrote for the Gay Authors website. And then, you look at the original and you look at what the finished product was, and they're just light years apart. But so we started it, we shelved it, we both went on to different places in our careers. Like I wrote fantasy, she delved into straight MM. So then we came back to it and we said, look, well, it's a one-off, what can we do? And so we decided that we were going to expand it into the entire campus series. So the whole series revolves around this fictional campus named after President Benjamin Harrison. And it was just like, trying to come up with a backstory. So the founder of the university was friends with the president. So the connection between all three books is that Harrison Campus is where at least one of all the main characters went to school there. And so then it's just different couples through their, different things that happened to them to get to their happy ever afters.
And what's going on in Better Be True?
So that one was that's the least connected to the campus. We started on campus and they moved to Philadelphia, which is kind of where I grew up. And since the university is in Pennsylvania, supposedly, it was just a nice, easy segue into there. But that's two students both have change of plans and end up in Philadelphia. They both they can't afford to live on their own. So they end up through a university hosting board, message board, they get together and they agree to room together. And it turns out that the single beds that were put together with a bed baffle that could be two single beds had been replaced by a king size bed, unbeknownst to them until they get there. And so then as this happens and as it goes along, Luke runs into his ex and Nico sort of steps up and pretends the first time to be his boyfriend. And then when Nico needs the favor, Luke steps up. And so it's just like this one after another until they finally realize they're not really faking so much anymore.
Fake boyfriend is such a favorite trope.
I know. I didn't know that when I wrote it, but it was just kind of an interesting, when we wrote it together, we just said, oh, what about this,
And then, combining that with Anita, because I know Anita loves the slow burn. You put a slow burn and a fake boyfriend together and it's kind of gold.
Right. It does. That is the trope. That trope definitely works for the slow burn. And it did. That in book 2 was like a rivals, enemies to lovers kind of thing. It's another one of those that you kind of take a while to figure out that, okay, you're not so bad after all.
Right. Tracking back the 9 years, when you wrote the original, how did the idea come up?
So when they were doing this contest, it was like, this is seriously the dark ages of MM romance, right? And so what we did was we kind of thought about what we wanted to write. And we both said, what'll sell best? A contemporary, that sort of thing. And so we tried to come up with a story. And then, we started with fraternity, which was Jackson Murphy was in the fraternity. And then the boyfriend was not. I will say this. I love the process with Anita. She's so brilliant. She really is her thought process is just so brilliant working with her. And so we threw out some ideas and she kind of ran with this and then I pushed that way and then she ran with this idea and then I just kind of supplied some of the U.S. college information and we kind of came together.
And you mentioned that it's light and day where the first book ended up from the first collaboration to making the first story to where it is now. What was the evolution like to continue to work on it and spruce it up to become the foundation of a series? So
we put it aside for probably about 5 years. We revisited it back in 2015, 2016, shelved it again. It evolved because, we learned so much. That's not, these are the things you needed in a romance. Jeff, when we wrote that, this whole trope stuff, the whole dual point of view character was not a big thing. And so this is of the 3 books, this is more literary than romancy, if I can use that word. Mm-hmm. We had the foster brother best friends romances kind of woven into that, the best female friend and her new romance. It was very literary in the sense that it had all the different subplots and everything got tied up and there were no loose ends. And then there was the romance, which was the strong point, but it didn't follow any of the tried and true tropes of, We didn't really try and hit the tropes when we wrote it. We tried to hit the story, which obviously if we were rewriting it today, it would look more like books 2 and 3. But it just evolved. I mean, just more sex, less non-romantic elements. So we added more romantic elements, took out some of the more dates, fewer interactions between the brothers.
More romance forward, I guess.
Right. We tried to, we learned enough that romance needed more, was it somebody told me every scene should promote the romance in a romance. Every scene should forward the romance. And we had a number of scenes that didn't really forward the romance in the original version because we didn't really know that. We were writing in 2010, 2011.
How did it feel to create a series from what started out as essentially this contest entry?
That was one of the fun parts of it because, we tried to look and say, okay, well, who else's story could we write? And so really when we wrote book 1, we didn't have an idea to put a second person in. So when we went back and rewrote it, we figured out, okay, which of these other characters can we start the next series on? And so that's where Darren came from. And just watching it, what I like about it is that we were able to just build on the universe that we'd started. So it was a lot easier doing 2 and 3 because in our heads we already knew what the campus looked like and who was this and where did the background from the campus come from and who had started it. All the little pieces that we had, like our little Bible. So it was it was almost like writing my fantasy series because, you had instead of having a whole new world, we just had this whole little universe that we had created and then we had backstory already.
How did you and Anita come together for collaboration? Because obviously this goes back years now since, round 1 of this happened so long ago.
So we met on the Gay Authors website and we just sort of got to know each other. We were like friends on that. And then the contest came up and she approached me and said, I'd really like to enter this and I want to enter it with you. I'm like, okay. And then her husband got transferred from Germany to Pittsburgh. And I live just north of DC in the suburbs. So it's like a 4.5-hour drive. So she used to come down and we worked on it together in my house. They were in a hotel at one point and, that's how it came together. We were able to sit down and actually talk, which I think probably cemented our friendship better. Just actually having spent that time together, seeing her husband, her kid. Her oldest was 3 at the time, and her youngest, it wasn't born then. We started on them online, and then we actually met in person, and then from there we've just stayed in touch ever since. It's sort of like if you wrote with somebody who lived across town, you probably wouldn't sit with them every day and write it. And that was sort of it. She was in Pittsburgh, and I was in Maryland. And so we wrote them on, but we actually got together and, sat down and worked it out together. And it was just the last bits, like the edits and things, the final drafts and stuff, we were able to sit down together and just kind of, you can see someone's facial expressions when you say something. They're like, you're like, okay,
right.
I just killed your baby. What's wrong? So it was easier to figure out her emotions and her to figure out mine, where I was coming from on stuff.
How has the collaboration evolved over the years?
I would say almost very little in some ways. I mean, we do the same thing now that we did then. We start with an outline, we start with an idea. I think one of the things that's changed is we have better technology. I mean, back then we were doing it on like a Google Hangout chat and, trying to scroll through and find out, what did you say? And you're trying to go find it. It was hard. Whereas now, we just cut and paste into a Word doc, and now we can do it we can do Skype, we can talk and type it out, and we can share screens. And so that sort of piece has changed. But we still sit down and we map out we have our broad story first, and then we map out scenes, and then we map out individuals in the scenes, what's going on, and then we put it together. And I think the one thing that has changed is that I typically write the rough drafts now. And she takes it from there, whereas in the past we would swap off chapters. And what we found was that it was easier to get the rough draft out, and then she would change it up, and then we would work. And then once we had that version, the two of us would go back and kind of smooth out the pieces that, I don't like this part, but I like this, and she'd be like, I don't like this part, but I like this, and so we'd smooth out where we needed to be. So that was the other change that's taken place, is that we've sort of let me do the rough draft, and then her take her stab at it, and then we come together and try and do it individually, chapters one by one.
How much discovery writing is there in that for you? I mean, is there space to kind of make stuff up as you go, or is it plotted so tightly that it becomes more like filling in the meat of things?
Well, I mean, no and yes, because on the one hand, there is no, I mean, we have like the outline that we're doing, right? And so that is sort of, yeah, that's sort of tight in the sense that it's what we agreed to. But, as I'm writing stuff, things just don't work. Like, we think about it. Oh, it's a great idea. And we're like, okay, let's go. And you start to write it and you're like, man, this is boring. Or man, this doesn't work. Or man, this is a problem. And so then we go, so I can, at that point, typically what I will do, because we have the time zone difference. Sometimes what I'll do is I will write something and send it off and then say, what do you think of this? So.
And that helps because she is in Europe. So by the time you wake up, she's probably already read it. And that could be very handy.
Yeah. And it does, because sometimes and when she comes back with her comments, I can look at them and say like, okay, I see that, or no, and here's why. And so it's really been great working with her, because she doesn't have like this. I mean, she's definitely light years above me in this writing field, but she doesn't have this ego. And so she listens. And then of course, usually I end up agreeing with her, but she doesn't have this, I'm right, you're wrong attitude. Sometimes she just has to let me painfully figure it out, and she lets me come along until I get to where she needs me to be. So it's really been great working with her that way.
Is this your first collaboration?
Well, yes, it was the first one she and I were the first one, and I haven't really published anything with anybody else yet, although there's a couple in the works. That's
cool. Anything you'd like to share to folks to get them interested in, or
considering that my co-author already put it on her newsletter? Yeah, BA Tortuga and I are writing a Western series together.
Oh, fantastic!
I was never a fan of Westerns until I started reading hers, and now I'm just like, and then I was like such a fan of hers, and I approached her and I said, "Hey, would you be interested in this?" And she said yes, and I was just like running around the house going, "Oh my god, she's gonna do it." My husband thought I was crazy.
So, what's it been like for you pivoting to Westerns from contemporary college campus?
It's interesting because she has to kind of bring me along into that genre somewhat, right? And so like not both, typically in a lot of these Westerns, one character is not as Western as the other. And so the hard part with writing that collaboration is she writes very differently than Anita and I wrote. So she likes it. I have my character. You have your character. I write my chapter. You look at it. You write your chapter. And so we have like we don't have near the same like outlining that we do. So it's it works, but it's different.
That's exciting. Looking forward to getting to read that when they come out for sure. With Harrison Campus, do you foresee more books in this universe?
Yes. So we're actually working on book 4, which has had a number of stops and starts because I started it, I didn't like it, I'd send it back to her, and then we'd try and work it out, and then I'd try again, and I'm like, I still didn't like it. And so finally we sat down, I guess it was in the last like 2 weeks, and we had like 2 or 3 Skype chats that lasted over an hour where we kind of hammered out like, and the only thing that's the same is that we're using the same main character from book 3 that we'd always planned to write. And so other than that, the whole story is different. So it's one of these older brother boyfriend kind of things, best friend brother sort of thing. And so it's sort of like a different one. And I had trouble with it. I really did. I had trouble initially with it because it's just sort of like it's written. You can't date your best friend's brother. It's like, it's written where? and so that was sort of like, that was initially the impediment, and it was like, this really doesn't work. And she's like, no, it doesn't. So we came up with a better scenario for a better outline for the story. And then there's another one after that, which we haven't quite decided whether we're going to make that book 5 or make it sort of like a spin-off series, because that one sort of follows a character from book 3, but it follows him in Philadelphia. So we're not sure what we're going to do with that yet.
Spin off and expand the universe.
Correct. Yes. And it'd be some of the same characters, but yeah, it would be a different link for the books. It would no longer be the Harrison campus because no one's going to be on the campus anymore.
What got you started writing and into storytelling?
So honestly, I needed a hobby. I remember it so clearly. We were in our old house in Virginia, and I'm not a TV fan. Like, I'm just not. I don't enjoy it. I have too short of an attention span. So like, I'll watch it and I'll get up and then I'll come back and I'll be missing things. So my husband's like, look, you need a hobby. It's like, you need a hobby. And so it's like, well, I've always wanted to write. I mean, I started writing in college. I gave it up when I went to law school. I gave it up when I was, starting to prosecute. And it was just like, if you know anything about being a prosecutor, it's intense at times, at least until you really get to the point where you're old hand at it. And so this was sort of a way for me to decompress, to, something to do while he watched television, because that was his way of decompressing at times. Especially if we're not going out, he had his shows that he watched, and I was just not interested. And so that was how I actually started with the fantasy series, and I would just write it, print it out at work, give it to him to read. And I remember we moved here to Maryland, right near the University of Maryland, and for whatever the reason, the story came to head about like college students. I'm like, all right, what the hell? They're all like right here. So I wrote that. I started writing contemporary, and that's the stuff I posted on gay authors that I met Anita through.
I like how you came to it a little later, because so many people we talk to, they've always written. And I like how you kind of came back to it starting as the decompression for things. That's a cool story.
Except for the fact that now, once you get knee deep into it, it sort of adds to the stress level when it shouldn't, once you get to that level.
Especially if you're on deadlines and people are waiting for your pages. It takes the hobbyist out of it for sure.
Right, it does.
You started in fantasy, so now are you still doing fantasy alongside the romance and the westerns and things?
I write under Andrew Q. Gordon under my fantasy. And when I finished that series, I kind of was like, I didn't think that there was another book, right? Because it's sort of like Lord of the Rings. Once you kill Sauron, what's next, right? I mean, who's you're going to create another bad guy just to like kind of save the world again? It kind of gets kind of old. So I didn't really see the next story in it. And somebody who was a fan sent me an email and just said, here, look, this is an idea for the next story. Do you have fan fiction? I'm like, no, but I mean, I talked to him about it. I'm like, I really like this idea. Can I run with it? And he's like, yeah. And so what I learned from him, which was really interesting, is that especially with high fantasy, you don't always have to save the whole universe. Sometimes it can be just about the character development. And so you can have like a smaller individual life or death situation that can be just as compelling as the overarching save the world. Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of fiddling with that, but I mean, Anita and I have been really working harder on the contemporary. And then I'm allowed to give shout outs, right?
Sure, absolutely.
So Meghan Maslow is a really good friend of mine. She and we live fairly close. And back before we were forced to quarantine, we used to meet for lunch. And she convinced me to work on her shared universe that she's planning. So it's like a paranormal romance. So that's going to be like an Andy Gallo book, because it's going to be more romance and lighter on the fantasy, whereas Andrew Q. Gordon is fantasy that has some gay characters. So that's sort of like a bridge to the two. That's sort of like the in-between with the romance but the fantasy element. So that might end up being my true love, because I get to do both. We've
talked about essentially 3 different stories here between Meghan's universe and what you're working on with BA and book 4 in Harrison Campus. Do you actually work on multiple books at one time, or is it like I'm finishing this and then I'm going to do this and then I'm going to do that?
The interesting thing is, because Anita and I live in such different time zones, and because Anita has her own deadlines and other things, I'll put stuff together and then I'll be like, okay, I need you to read this. And she's like, okay, but I have these other things first. And so, okay, I put it aside and then I can go work on something else. And BA is sort of doing the same thing. She has other works in place. And so we typically, I put like 1 day a week or 1 or 2 days a week to that story. And then the rest stays with the other story. I have not really worked on Meghan's universe. I haven't worked on that book that much. I have an outline. She and I have talked about it, but I'm not doing 3 at once. I'm just not. I mean,
that would make my head short circuit.
It's hard to remember which voice you're in when you do that. So that's why I'm not doing that.
And eventually you'll come back perhaps to Andrew Q. Gordon as well and work on that story sometime.
So whenever I'm kind of like contemporary out, or I'm not really feeling the romance right now, because, As you know, it's hard right now. My daughter is home 24/7. My husband has always worked at home, so he's not thrilled with having us here 24/7. Sort of interrupts his. And so there are times when I'm just not feeling very romantic. And so the romance isn't there. So I'll sometimes just go pick that apart and just pick that up for a little bit. And I mean, I've got maybe 2,000 words into that story. So it's like, as you can see, I'm not doing a whole lot into it right now.
I guess it's kind of cool that you can escape into whatever universe you want to in the moment between the projects.
Yeah, because sometimes I really do feel more like writing or just dealing with fantasy, which has, I like to create something new. And when I say create something new, I'm like, that's mine, right? I don't know if you've ever written fantasy, but that's yours. I mean, Harrison Campus is yours, yeah, but it's sort of like built in this world, so you're still constricted to this, all the things that happen now. Whereas my fantasy world, I'm God.
Right. Yeah, I've never taken the leap on fantasy because having to do the whole world building thing and build the universe, I just don't know that I could take that leap and do it.
It was hard. I mean, where I got lucky, is that because I had started when my husband had talked me into picking up a hobby, I was literally almost 2 million words into that story before I started to even pare it down to publish it. So by the time I really went back and started rewriting book one, I already had 1.5 million, almost 2 million words in that universe. So I knew that world before I really started to write it, which was incredibly helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had written myself into about 17 different boxes in book one that had to, that changed over the scope of the story. And so then when I went back, I already knew where the story was going.
Right.
And so that was incredibly helpful having this didn't happen. Magic didn't work quite like that. I thought it did the first time. And if you do that, well then how does that, if you can do this over here, why can't you do this over here and just solve the problem and to fix those things?
That's a lot of words to deal with too. Having a couple million words to pare down.
They weren't very good words all the time.
With all this writing going on that you've had, what have you actually been reading over the summer that you might recommend to our listeners?
So I've tried to catch up on a few of the stories that B.A. Tortuga wrote because I'm trying to write books for her. And I really liked Cowboy's Law, which was really just kind of like, I think that was sort of like her, I don't want to say coming out because she's been so known in the world, but it was probably one of her best-selling books. So I think it introduced her to expanded the reach of the people that she has been reading. I'm currently reading After Felix by Lily Morton, just because it struck me as it was a good cover. I like the cover guy, but it's a great book.
So some good stuff there. Lily Morton, very high on my to-read list because I love her work. It's always so fun.
Yes, that's
good
great
escapism.
Word. Her characters are just, I think she would call them cheeky, but I mean, that's really...
I think I would too, yes.
But that's the word for it. And I'm just like, wow, this is really, it's different from a lot of people I read. So that's what makes it great.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about a lot of different work. What's coming out next? Like what looks like it's going to be the first thing out the door coming up?
The only thing I know for sure is that I committed to putting something out in March with Meghan Maslow's Universe series. So I think that might be the next one. But we spent so much time, for me, it was a process learning how to put books out by myself. These were the first really true releases that I did on my own. And then we committed to do 3 within 65 days, which was like, oof.
Wow.
And we thought it would be better to do the whole series. Like we had it mostly written. So then we had to start figuring out the whole process and getting it edited and covers and lining up the voice actor for the audiobooks and all that stuff. And so then it started to hit, and then we had to promo it. And then as soon as you finish that one, the next one came, and you had to promo that. And the next one came, and you had to promo that. So I don't know that anything's going to come out from me for another 8-9 months. But then again, it might be like another wave, because by that point I've had all these things that I have been writing that should be much closer to release.
Book 1 of Harrison Campus is on audiobook. What was it like having a book of yours flipped over to audio? And it's done by Nick Russo, who's one of my favorites out there in the MM world. What was it like hearing your words translated in that format?
It was incredible because, by the time we started the audiobook, I was so tired of the series. We'd written it, we edited it, we re-edited it, we proofread it. I mean, I don't know how other people do it, but I'm a horrible proofreader. And so what I have to do is I have to literally read each word out loud to see if I can catch things. And I did. And this was after other people proofed it and after edited and stuff. So by the time it got to Nick, I was so over it. And then he did it and he started giving me these things. And I'm like, wow, I really like this again. And it kind of brought the joy back into the story. I mean, that's just the best way to say it. I was like really excited for it again after just listening to him. And he's so good with the way he does it. And shout out to Nick. He's just amazing to work with. He's so easy to work with. And he made it easy for me because it was our first time. Because they don't do ACX in Germany. So Anita really can't get her books out on her own. She has to work through a service. And so it was our first time doing it. So Nick was just wonderful with it.
Do we get the other books in the series over time?
It depends on ACX. They're really horrible with this. But yes, when I contacted Nick, I contracted all 3 books for him. 2 is already with ACX waiting for their quality review. Okay. It took almost 3 months for them to get the first book out. And we were anticipating like 30 days.
Yeah.
So he is actually recording book 3 right now. It better be true. And he should have that done towards the end of August, beginning of September.
So what's the best way for folks to keep up with you online? Keep up with when the next audiobooks come out and all these releases you've got coming out over the next year or so?
So for Anita, her group is called Slow Burn Sunday. And that's usually the best way. She's pretty active in it. You can get all her links there. AnitaSunday.com is her website. She has a newsletter. She's giving out like a whole bunch of free books in there. So if you haven't signed up, go to her website and link up with her on her newsletter or join her group. And for me, Andy Gallo is my website, andygallo.com. I'm in the process of getting the whole, I haven't really, this whole process of being a real author is hard sometimes. So I'm getting, the website's being redesigned right now. And once they finish that, I will have a newsletter at that point. But I have a reader group. It's called Glorious Readers, which is sort of a play on Andy Gallo, or just my email, andy@andygallo.com.
Excellent. We will link to all of that in the show notes so people can find the books and the websites and the reader groups and everything else. Andy, thank you so much for spending some time and telling us about Harrison Campus and everything else you're working on.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it.